Hello, my name is Corinne, and I am a senior fellow with the Center for Writing and Scholarship at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And this is a workshop series that I've been leading called The Foundations of Academic Writing. It's specifically geared towards students, the BAC at CIIS, though it's certainly applicable to a wider audience. But the way that this workshop works is that each week I tackle a different aspect of academic writing, broadly speaking, and then try to tailor it a little bit to assignments or to the thrust of learning in the Bachelor Completion Program. So this week's topic is evidence. And it comes in a string of topics. So this is the fourth that we've had so far. The first one was critical reading, and specifically how to critically read assignments for school. The second one was the critical reflective essay genre, which is a very popular genre, assignment genre, in the Bachelor Completion Program. And then last week, we did a workshop on thesis statements, and specifically we focused on how you might apply a thesis statement, which is quite academic in origin or bent or whatever, to the critical reflective genre, which is perhaps a bit less academically oriented. So today's workshop, Working with Evidence, is going to follow up of all of those and probably mix in components from all of those. Still academic in its bent, but I will be speaking also about what evidence might mean in the context of critical reflective writing. So with all that in mind, for those of you who have attended or watched these workshops before, you know that I like to kick off with some timed writing. This is just for you, probably to help you arrive in the space of thinking about writing. So play along at home, if you will. And if you're not interested in playing along, then I guess you have 1 minute to your own devices. Okay, so for 1 minute, I would love for you to write about what you think of when you hear the term evidence in response to writing. So what does evidence mean to you at this moment in time? 1 minute, begin. Okay, great. That was a minute. Now I would love for you to take 30 seconds. You can use that list or you can use that writing or not, but 30 seconds to make a list of all the things that you think might count as evidence or any type of evidence that comes to mind when thinking about writing. Okay, so 30 seconds, evidence, list, go. Okay, already that's 30 seconds. I didn't get so far on my own list. Okay, let's do 1 more minute about what brought you here today, or what you're hoping to learn. Just maybe you can name that for yourself since I'm not able to actually hear it. 1 minute, what brought you here today? Free writing, begin. Okay, great. Lovely. Well, were we gathered in person with one another, I would have us all look over our notes and introduce ourselves with some of this information, perhaps what you want to know, what you already think of in terms of thesis statements. But we're going to skip that part because we can't actually do it. And it would probably be a little bit boring for me to just list for you all the things I already think about evidence. Or it would be a bit redundant since I'm going to go through that for the rest of this workshop. That said, maybe it'd be kind of fun to read the list that I came up with. Like I said, when we were doing it, I didn't get very far, but this was the list of things that I thought might count as evidence in the context of writing sometimes. So I said statistics, personal stories or experience, interviews, other texts, so like other sources or readings. And then I said tables, like tables or charts or graphs, kind of like statistics. That's as far as I got. Okay, so having done that, let's just, let's launch in. Let me give you my broadest understanding of the word that's used to support an argument or a claim. Now, again, this is very much in the context of argumentative writing that I have this framework, right, in thinking about evidence. However, I think it's applicable to other genres of writing as well. As we move into thinking about evidence more specifically and thinking about ways of working evidence into writing, and I'll pause here to say that later on in the workshop, we're going to get to tactics for weaving in quotations and for paraphrasing and summarizing texts. So ways of working with readings. That's what that is. Okay, I lost my train of thought. So that's where we're headed. But I want to recap with the thesis statement stuff that we covered last week and just say very broadly that we discussed thesis statements first in the context of academic writing as being some claim that you're making with a piece of writing. So the idea behind argumentative writing is that you have a perspective, an opinion, and hey, it's unique to you because you're the only one who sees the world the way that you do and who assembles evidence or assembles different sources into a particular idea. You're the only one that can possibly come up with that idea. So thesis statement is a unique argument that you are making based on your position in the world that is defensible. It's something that someone could argue with, which means someone could say, no, that's not correct the way that you see the world. So then the academic process is about taking that thesis statement, that argument, and sort of like defending it through the course of the paper with evidence. Okay, so one thing we did last week was we looked at this handout called Breaking Down Thesis Statements, and I'm going to pull that up as I'm speaking now. But the way that that handout works is it talks about if thesis statements are the like major argument that runs through the scope of the whole paper, okay, then built into those thesis statements are a set of smaller claims that each must be proved in order for the thesis statement itself at large to be proved. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can see this on your own screen. Great. So the way that this, what this handout does is it takes a simple thesis statement like hunger persists in Glandalemia because jobs are scarce and farming in the infertile soil is rarely profitable. Okay, it takes that and it breaks it down into all of these smaller claims that are embedded within that major claim. So if someone was going to prove that argument that hunger persists in Glandalemia, they'd actually have to prove all of these things, that people are hungry in Glandalemia, that jobs are scarce in Glandalemia, that the soil in Glandalemia is infertile, that infertile soil in fact makes for unprofitable farming, and that there's a link, right, between unprofitable farming and scarce jobs and hunger, that all of those things are related. So it seems like a pretty simple claim about why hunger exists, but a lot of other things have to be proved in order for that thesis statement to be proved, okay? So that is, if that's the way the thesis statement breaks down, then you can think about evidence as fitting in within each of these categories. Evidence is like what is being used to prove these things. So if people are hungry in Glandolinea, you've got to have something that that validates that opinion. Now, it could be the author's personal experience, and they could say that they've witnessed it, but it might be more effective, depending on audience, to use examples, evidence that maybe is statistical. Maybe this is a good place for some data about hunger rates, or people who are skipping meals in the country, or food sales, those kinds of things. Similarly, when jobs are scarce, probably would want to have some statistics on unemployment rates and how those have gone up over time, those kinds of things. So with a paper like this, it seems like the evidence might be a bit more quantitative or statistical in nature. If you scroll down, however, and look at a different thesis statement, like this one here, okay, the first one. So while most American families would view consanguineal marriage as a threat to the nuclear family structure, many Iranian families, like my own, believe that these marriages help reinforce kinship ties in an extended family. Okay, now we're talking about some evidence that's probably a little bit different in nature. So let's take a second to think about what kinds of evidence might be more effective in proving this statement, this thesis statement. Well, the first thing I notice is that the author references their self. So many Iranian families like my own. So this author would need to, is suggesting that the evidence will in fact be personal. So if families, like this author's own, believe that marriages help reinforce kinship ties, perhaps the evidence there is interviews or text from family members or family stories, that kind of thing. This here, that while most American families would view consanguineal marriage as a threat, is a pretty strong claim and might be a little bit hard to prove. It might be the way that the author feels, but in order to prove it, the author would need to think about effective evidence. So maybe that would be, I'm not sure, quotes from popular media, interviews with American families, maybe like another sampling of data. Now I'm just riffing on it. But the other thing that the author might do is put together texts. So quote authors who have made similar arguments and say that there is a long tradition of people writing against consanguineal marriage or writing for it, right? And that this author fits their own position into that string of authors. Okay, that's probably enough for this handout here, so I'm going to stop screen sharing that and say, so what starts to happen with these academic processes is that the author of a paper is assembling all different pieces of evidence that they find will be most effective in proving a thesis statement, which is the major claim that the paper's covering. Okay, so evidence supports thesis. Now, as we discussed last week, the way that looks in a piece of critical reflective writing may be slightly different than it looks in a piece of like hard and fast academic writing. The main reason that the critical reflective writing is about the self, and it's about one's personal experience. So already there's the element definitely of personal experience as evidence. Now, that said, we talked about the thesis as still being the overall idea, so the main idea of the paper. And if a piece of argumentative writing is intended to change an audience, right, so to convince the readers of the author's perspective, maybe a piece of critical reflective writing is about demonstrating change or naming a change that has taken place in the self. So before this event happened, I was this way. Now I'm this way. Before I read this text, I was this way. Now I think about the world this way. So there's change in the self. And the thesis statement in a critical reflective piece of writing may be just that, a naming of the change from the perspective of the author who's now able to look back on the time sequence. Okay, so my thesis is that after having read this book, They Say, I Say, I now have more in-depth understanding of what the writing process is. It's not a very strong thesis, it wasn't terribly detailed, but you get the idea. Something happened, now I'm different. Okay, so if that's a thesis in a critical reflective piece of writing, then, and we know that the evidence is probably like personal experience, right? There's this other piece missing, which is what you do with the evidence to help it prove the thesis, what you do with the evidence. And let's say that that piece is analysis. So you can't have evidence without analysis. Since I brought this book up, I actually want to take a second to read a quote from it that I have always found particularly inspiring. And the quote has to do with the way that the process of, well, the way that academia works in general, the way that conversations happen. Okay. This is from someone in the composition world named Kenneth Burke. And okay, this is a description of what it's like to be an academic or to write in general. So, you come late. When you arrive, others have long preceded you, and they are engaged in a heated discussion, a discussion too heated for them to pause and tell you exactly what it is about. You listen for a while until you decide that you have caught the tenor of the argument. Then you put in your oar. Someone answers you. You answer him. Another comes to your defense. Another aligns himself against you. The hour grows late. You must depart. And you do depart with the discussion still vigorously in progress. So the way I read this, my analysis of this piece of writing is that Burke is talking about what it's like to start to map a field in academic writing, or to map a field as an academic. So first you start by reading, you start collecting a lot of different pieces of information. And once you've collected enough, finally you start to have perspective on it, and you feel like there's something that you can say to contribute to the conversation. So you add up everything that you've learned and you say, hey, I think. And once you've said, I think, other people argue with you, or they defend you and use your argument as part of their own argument to build on, and the conversation keeps going, and you've been just a little piece of it, a stepping stone. And then at a certain point, you leave the party, you leave the conversation, but it's still happening, and people are still quoting you and saying things that you've said. So we can think about academic writing as, or again, writing in general, as joining the conversation. And with that in mind, we can think about all of the things that you read as texts and eventually incorporate into your own writing as sources that you use as your own evidence to make your unique argument. So the thing that you're going to say at the party, you take bits and pieces from everything that you read and say this thing. And to back that thing up, you have all these other thinkers and writers who've come before you. I don't know if that image works for you as well as it works for me, but I quite like it because it makes me feel like I can be an individual even within academic writing processes that are a bit more formal, as it were. But to return to this analysis piece for a second, I got a bit sidetracked with my Burke quote. And I guess to build off of workshops that have come before, I think it's nice to think about the work that you do when reading sources, which we discussed in the first workshop as being critical reading, to think about analysis as being kind of like putting select bits of your critical reading onto paper and writing them out. So if when you're reading critically, you're kind of like mining a text for what's going on with it, you're trying to reconstruct the author's original rhetorical context. You're going like, when was this piece written and who was it written for? And am I included in the audience or am I excluded somehow for it? And what has the author failed to consider in putting together this argument? If you're thinking, is it relevant? All these kinds of questions. If you're thinking through all of these and you're in dialogue with the text when you're reading it, performing analysis is a little bit like taking the text, taking some aspect of it, and saying that you think that thing about it and why you think it. So you might want to analyze a text by saying the author makes this argument, but this argument is dated and is no longer applicable for X, Y, Z reason, right? And that would be one way of sort of analyzing. Or you could say the author chooses this particular word, and the word signifies to me blank, 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 and therefore is dismissive of these particular populations, and I don't subscribe to the author's argument for that reason. Or it's psychologically interesting that they choose this word because in this author's life, they had this sort of thing going on. You could go any direction with the piece of text and how you want to work with it, or the source and how you want to work with it. But the analysis stage is what you do with the evidence. So we could think of analysis, say, as putting the critical reading into writing critically, all right? Or we could think of analysis as being the shift from description into interpretation. So it's one thing to say what a text says, and it's really important to be able to state the author's intended argument or what you think the author was trying to do with the text. And then there's also the interpretation of it, which is how you personally read it, which might be a little bit different from what the author intended, or might be a way that you're choosing to read the text in particular. You might be wanting to do a feminist reading of a text, or a queer reading of a text, or a Marxist reading of a text, or an ecological reading of a text, where you're paying attention to certain aspects of the text. So you're paying attention to the ways that the environment, the non-human, the natural world is being backgrounded or foregrounded. You can focus on those particular elements of a text and do an interpretation that it's sort of like where the scope is named. But in any case, maybe the important thing to do with analysis is, one, use the analysis part to loop back to the main argument that you're making. And we're going to return to that later, just a little bit. But also to specify what criteria or patterns you're looking for. So to say how you're going to read the text. So it's not just, so that you're giving the audience some understanding of, I guess, where you're coming from. So you might say, I'm choosing to do an ecological reading of this text, so that the author doesn't think it's just, so that the audience doesn't think it's like a willy-nilly thing. You're specifically reading or only looking for those components as you approach the material. Maybe a little bit far out, but before we get too far out from from the idea of analysis, I wanna pull up a piece of writing here. So do another screen share thing. I hope you're able to see it. Give me. Okay. Now, this piece of writing, this is on a handout. It's about quote sandwiching, which again is something we're going to get to. But this handout is by Professor Robert McDermott, who is a professor at CIIS in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. It's the one that I came from. This is an essay that he wrote in 1993. And we're going to read through this essay, maybe in the interest of time and not boring you too much. Not that it's boring, Robert. let's read just the first two paragraphs of this, okay? And the first time through, I'd like you to pay attention to just what happens, so what the text says. Okay, so what the text says, see if you can restate it in your own mind after I've read it. So I'm going to go through now. In contemporary American culture, individualism is associated with anti-community values, with the conventional male ideal of the solitary hero. The popular idea of individualism, like the prevalent idea of freedom, is tied to wanting one's own way, one's own space, one's own style, one's own income and security, one's own control of family and relationships. There is a strong tradition from Edwards to contemporary transpersonalism, however, which espouses an individualism of context and relation. Whether transcendentalist or transpersonalist, founding fathers or the civil rights movement, the deepest and most distinctive American ideal of the individual is one which affirms the universal and community as sources and goals of individual development. Whereas the popular conception has celebrated the independent, the classical view celebrates the interdependent. The new paradigm view of the human being is significantly closer to the classical view than to the popular view. This new paradigm ideal of the individual would be strengthened if its exponents recognized their philosophical assumptions to be similar to distinctively American images of the individuals. The individualism of both transcendentalism and transpersonalism concerns the self in the context of progressively larger contexts and ultimately in relation to a universal reality. Whereas the ideal of freedom in popular rhetoric aims at license to fulfill the needs of personality, the ideal of freedom in Emerson and Martin Luther King Jr. and in transpersonalism is rooted in the freedom which the individual can create only in and through an altered sense of self, one which lifts the personality to an intimate bond with the transpersonal. All right, great. So as a step one, I said, let's see if we can just map the argument here. So this would be sort of, as we're saying, the description state of performing analysis, like a way of naming, seeing if we can reconstitute the author, McDermott's intended argument, what McDermott is trying to say. And I guess the way that I would gloss this here in the moment speaking to you is to say that okay, McDermott is arguing that people commonly think of individualism as being all about individual personality and having a sort of solitary existence in the world. However, there is a tradition related to transpersonalism, and I guess transpersonalist thinkers, that suggests that individualism is intimately related to community, that the goal of the individual is community, and that individuals come out of the community. And then I think McDermott goes on to say that people within the new paradigm would be well served to recognize their links to these sort of transpersonalist American ideals. Okay, so maybe that's my summary of what we just read, and maybe you have a different one, which is, I'm sure, equally valid or probably better said than my own. But having done that, so this is a description part. To move to analysis, we'd have to offer some sort of like interpretation or follow-up or way of thinking about what McDermott said. So some critical reading of what McDermott said. So one way to go about this might be to look at, I don't know, how McDermott is conceiving of the American in general. So contemporary American culture, that's sort of a large idea. And he says in the first line that individualism is associated with anti-community values with the conventional male idea of the solitary hero. Okay, one thing I might say in response to that is, well, according to whose America, right? American culture is too broad, perhaps, of a subject to make the kind of claim that there's any singular association, or the is associated. Well, who is doing that association? The anti-community values. Perhaps America is too disparate to make those kinds of broad claims. So one way of reading that would be, if I were to speak critically about McDermott builds his own argument against what he identifies as an American bent, an American interpretation of individualism as being linked to the solitary. However, McDermott has failed to account for all of the smaller disparate communities that make up the larger American culture, and he's spoken too broadly in representing them. Okay, that might be one way of going about this. Or another way of maybe critically reading this text would be to say that McDermott has focused on how the new paradigm ideal would be strengthened if it identified more closely with more classical ideas. But he has yet to really demonstrate why that would be strengthening. And his argument would be built more effectively if he detailed how he sees that identification or strengthening taking place. All right, so I'm gonna come back and look at you for a second. Were we in person, I would be very curious to ask you some sorts of general questions to get you thinking about what your own analysis of this text might be. It might be that you don't care about it at all. Maybe you don't have any interest in American ideals, or you don't think that this is a relevant argument, or you don't feel included within McDermott's references to a New Age community, for instance. There could be all kinds of ways that you don't feel you have access to the text, or you do feel you have access to the text, but you feel misrepresented by it, those kinds of things. These would be questions I'd want to ask you. I'm going to ask you broadly if you like it or if you dislike it. It's written in 1993. If you think it's still relevant and is an okay thing to quote from, to like bring to the party, as it were, when you're making your own arguments in the world. I would ask you those kinds of questions. And then I would probably ask you to think about selecting from the essay something that you agree with, something that you disagree with, and something that you kind of agree with but would like to tweak or amend a little bit. And in listing these three things, I'm getting the idea again from this book here. Let me just show it to you upright. Really suggest getting it. It's great. They Say, I Say, The Moves That Matter in Academic Writing, by Gerald Graff and Kathy Berkenstein. But they suggest that there are really only three ways to respond to a text, three ways to perform analysis on a piece of evidence. So those would be yes, no, and okay, but. So you can disagree with something and say why you disagree. So actually, I think I did that in the first instance. I disagreed with McDermott's claim about Americans because I thought it was too broad of a claim to make and wasn't backed up by enough sources, by enough evidence. So you can disagree and say why. You can agree and like add on to it. You can agree and say why you agree. So like, this is exactly right, and it's right because I know for a fact, you know, that I have experienced blah, 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 blah. Okay, or you can say, okay, but you can say, while McDermott's argument is compelling, and I like the idea that transpersonalism actually has roots in classical lineages, but I like that idea. I think McDermott is speaking too broadly. So you can take a part of the argument that you like and want to keep, and then part of it that you want to amend, or what you would say differently. Those are the three ideas: yes, no, okay, but. So maybe it would be fun to take a few seconds in your head right now to think about what your yes is, what your no is, what your okay, but is. All right, so I'm gonna sip the water. Okay. So then, So then, if we repeat this format again, if we think about, well, let's think about the whole academic writing structure, just kind of like as it flows down from a thesis statement, as it were. So you've got an introduction, which is kind of like lending context, setting up the reader. Introduction narrowing to a thesis statement, which comes at the end of the introduction usually, and is a statement of the main argument, the central claim of the paper. Then the rest of the paper, all of the body paragraphs, are in support of that thesis statement. So they're working to prove some aspect of it. So that's like the breaking down thesis statement handout that we looked at, right? And within each of those paragraphs is evidence, which is working to prove the main claim of that paragraph. So each part of the larger argument is being supported by the evidence. Okay. So then the question begins, well, how do you represent that evidence in the paragraph? One part of it we've discussed is you've got the evidence and then you have to perform analysis on it. So you may do some description or summary or paraphrase or quotation from the source text, right? And then you analyze it. So the handout that we were looking at before, okay, this one here with McDermott's essay, as part of a handout that's called, can I quote you on that? Quote sandwiching. And it presents the basic idea that any quote that you work with in a piece of academic writing needs to be sandwiched, as it were, between an initial line of text that lends context to and introduces where the reading is coming from. So that's sort of like what I did before I started reading from McDermott's. I said, like, this is from an essay that McDermott wrote in 1993. McDermott is a professor at CIIS. I've told you things that I thought might be relevant to your understanding the reading that was to come. Okay, then you have a setting up and the actual quote itself. So, like, as McDermott explains, comma, quotation mark, there's a quote that follows. Okay, then there's the analysis step of the quote, which is the way that you read the text that was just excerpted. All right, so that's called the quote sandwich, and the idea is that no quote, no like meat, no like piece of meat, if the quote is ever left without having a bun on either side, some sort of introductory material, and then an analysis of it. And in fact, the analysis is the most important part because that's where all the work of the paper happens. Because with each bit of analysis that you perform, you're linking it back to the main argument. You're saying why the quote that you've just selected or the statistic that you've just discussed or what have you is relevant to the larger argument that you're making toward the paper, in the paper. Okay, so that, we're going to come back to this handout one more time later. But we can think of the process being the same with any piece of evidence that you bring in, or any way that you bring in evidence. So it doesn't matter if you're bringing in a quote or if you're doing what is done with evidence in other academic spheres would be to summarize or to paraphrase, not spheres. I mean, in other parts of a paper, okay? I'm gonna now pull up another handout. This is a handout that was made by another fellow at CIIS last year. It's called 3 Forms of Bringing in Sources. And it's talking about the options that you have when you want to incorporate reading into a piece of writing. So you have the option to paraphrase, to quote, we were just talking about that, or to summarize. And the basic distinction between the 3 of these, right? Let's start with, well, let's look at this handout. I find it useful, this page. Let's start with summarizing. When you're summarizing, you're taking a large piece of information. So it could be a book, an entire book, or it could be a chapter, or it could be several paragraphs, and you are condensing it. You're just bringing out the main arguments. So the piece of text that you write is a restatement of the argument, but it's a much smaller one, okay? So if I were to summarize McDermott's essay, I would say McDermott stresses the importance of viewing individualism within its classical understanding as being derivative of and supportive of community, okay? That's could be a summary that I would offer. And the summary can be a great way of really just getting at the essence of a text. Alternately, you've got paraphrasing, and paraphrasing would be, this is the one at the top here, only taking what's needed and sort of like restating in your own words, but taking up the same amount of space what an argument is saying. So I might want to take just one line of McDermott's essay and say that in my own words, or put that in a way that would make more sense to the argument. Okay, and then there's quoting, of course, which is about keeping the author's text entirely intact. Now, both with summary and paraphrase, the benefit is that you, I'll take this away. The benefit is that you get to use your own language. So if you think about your experience as a reader, you can be reading along and really starting to get into an author's voice and enjoying the text. And it can be kind of disruptive to have someone else's text, which can be a different way of expressing themselves, just thrown in. So to have to have an author who quotes frequently can be disruptive to a reader. So the great thing about paraphrasing or summarizing is that you can keep the flow of your own writing up. You can use your own words, and you can weave what other authors have said easily into the context of your writing. So I would say that it's a strong choice to paraphrase or to summarize in writing. I want to put a caveat in here and say that citation is super important, and with any of these, anytime you bring in evidence, you want to cite the evidence properly. So summarizing or paraphrasing doesn't exempt you from needing a citation. It's still, yeah, even if you're giving a brief description of an entire book, it should still mean, usually it depends on the style guide you're using, but author's last name, the year it was published. And if you're referencing something specific, like a specific argument, like you would do if you were paraphrasing, or if you're quoting like a moment in the text, then you definitely want the page number also. Okay, that was the side note. But okay, paraphrasing, summarizing, both in your own words, but both ways of incorporating a text into your own writing, okay? And then alternately, there's quoting. We were discussing quoting earlier. I think there's a common trap in writing to want to overquote. Maybe this happens for a couple reasons. I think oftentimes I'm so impressed with the people I read that I want to preserve as much of their writing as possible. And I think that's a great reason for wanting to quote, because you think you just can't do it, can't say it any better than the author said it. But as I was saying earlier, it can be a little bit disruptive to the reader to have to switch between writerly voices so frequently. So then another reason that people want to quote frequently has to do with taking up space, I think. You can get a good quote in there, it takes up a lot of space. But this is, I think, a trap to be avoided. It can be a little bit of a flag to the reader, the professor, but maybe more so it's just a good way to kind of lose your reader. I know when I'm reading, if I approach a big block text and I'm trying to read a document quickly, I'm more likely to skip the block text and see what the author has to say about the block text, because I'm looking for how they've constructed their argument, right? So if we want to think about what the benefits of quoting might be, when it's actually advantageous to quote over paraphrasing or summarizing, I'd say it happens only in a specific few instances. So the reasons I have identified for quoting are as follows. It's probably preferable to quote when you can't paraphrase or summarize, you find, without changing the author's intent. So we're going to call this reason accuracy. Properly represent the author, it's best just to quote from them. Okay, accuracy. Then I think also there's authority. Sometimes the virtue of who you're quoting from lends a lot of power to your argument. So if you can say, can you believe that even blank, blank, blank said that? Even President Obama believes that, blank, blank, blank. It's sometimes good to quote because you've got the authority, you've got the person represented in their full authority. It's not your interpretation of what they said, they actually said this thing. Similarly, it can be good to quote when there's unforgettable language, when there's something about the text itself that is not only remarkable, but it's probably something that you're going to bring up in your analysis of the text. And it's a really good idea to quote, right? So when in forgettable language, or when there's something to like the rhetorical choice that the author made, when you want to focus on the one word that they used and question why they used it, really good to quote because it's actually their language and their way of speaking that you will be analyzing. Okay. And then finally, and I would use this one sparingly, but there's conciseness. Sometimes trying to paraphrase or to summarize is just going to make your own writing too long and complicated, so it's better to say it in the author's words. But I would say that that one is like maybe a little bit less important than some of the others, or is a little bit trickier to know. Like, when is this really best left up to the author? Okay, but with any of those processes, quoting, summarizing, paraphrasing, you want to follow, as I discussed, the same basic pattern. You want to say, you want to lend context, right? You've got to have the sandwich, the context, the where it's coming from. So this could be a line like, you've been making some argument and you say, in a similar manner, Graf and Birkenstein book, They Say, I Say, focuses on important rhetorical moves in academic writing. Okay, and then you want to get a little more deeper into, so that's your sort of like setting up of the argument, which might be a little bit of a summary in itself, I suppose. And then you want to get into the actual burger of it and say, in particular, they suggest that there are only 3 ways to respond to a piece of writing, saying yes, no, or okay, but. We're going to call that a paraphrase, what I just did, or since, yeah, okay. And I would maybe put the page number that it came from. And then there's the analysis. I find this technique to be especially helpful. And it's not just that I find it to be that way, I should also say why. Because in my with my analysis to keep using, to keep deepening into how that relates to my larger argument, which might be about how this book is, I don't know, important academic writing, something like that. So maybe as just a sort of follow-up now, it's time to return to the quoting handout and think about how we might build a sandwich with a quote here. So having discussed, as we did, why it's important to quote, let's take a few minutes to now read over this and think about what a good quote would be. So remember, the parameters are, let's look for a quote. So we're definitely going to use, in setting up our quote sandwich here, McDermott's text. Okay, so in selecting text, think about where there's authority or unforgettable language that you want to talk about, or maybe accuracy, any of those reasons why it might be good to choose to use a text. Okay, let's see. Okay, great. So maybe the quote that I want to select here to work with is material. Okay, so we're in the third paragraph now, and it's the second line in. Materialism in this context refers to the increasingly definitive American penchant for having, controlling, and moving the fullest possible supply of goods and services. See, and it's a little bit of language, I suppose, but I want to talk about McDermott's definition. So I'm going to flag this because McDermott is giving his definition of materialism. All right. So my sentence that I'm choosing is that materialism in this contract refers to the increasingly definitive American penchant for having, controlling, and moving the fullest possible supply of goods and services. All right. So then if this handout, having selected a quote, helps you move through the stages of sandwiching that quote, of setting it up such that it's going to like support your larger argument. Takes you through the steps of the first bread being the context, the veggie burger or the meat being the quote itself, right? And then the other bread. So on the left side of this handout are some templates that you could perhaps use. And if you have the Grafenbergenstein book, you can go to page 15 or 222 for lists of other templates that are effective for introducing the quote and creating context or giving important background information or outlining the key arguments that have come before the quote that you're going to use. But let's say with my quote, which is going to be hard because I'm not writing and I'm just trying to do it off the top of my head. But let's see. Okay. I may say that in McDermott's 1993 essay, he argues that one of the key, one of the blocks to understanding individualism as being related to communities and community values is the idea of materialism. So that might be my introduction. So that would be the bread. This is how I'm going to lead up to my point. I'm prepping you with what McDermott's argument has been so far. Okay, then my middle section would be the actual quote itself. I would say specifically, McDermott suggests that materialism is for having, controlling, and moving the fullest possible supply of goods and services. Okay, then I want to analyze it. And let's say that my thesis for this paper, my argument, is something I was speaking of earlier about how while McDermott makes a worthy argument, he doesn't, he conceives of America in terms that are too broad. That's my whole argument. So far I've set up the quote by saying that McDermott positions materialism as a block to understanding individualism as being linked to communities, right? Specifically, he suggests that materialism is the American penchant for having, for moving resources, or, you know, as the quote I read aloud was. Okay, and then I want to analyze this. And now, since I flagged his specific language, and since that's something when I talk, what I want to talk about is his definition, my analysis should probably relate to that. So maybe I want to say, and this is where I can yes, no, or okay, but. So I probably want to okay, but, and say, while I resonate with McDermott's definition, I nevertheless think that McDermott himself is moving to extremes in describing Americanism, what it means to be an American. He continually refers to terms like fullest possible, and this strikes me as a rather extremist position. In my experience of Americans, I don't know. This not quite so extreme. It's a bit of a softer position toward having, and having is economic conditions. I don't know. I'm gonna stop there. But I hope that the basic idea I was getting at here is clear, that the quote itself is sandwiched, right, between the context that sets it up, the meat, which is the quote that you've selected, and the other bread, the analysis that links it back, that always links it back to the larger argument you're making. All right, now that's a little bit of, or that's a lot of it, of the academic writing process. Having moved through all of that, I think it's time talking about what that looks like within less academic or the critical reflective essay genre. And I'll say that within this genre, if the evidence is predominantly your own experience and also your own understanding of texts, then the analysis portion of that has to do with how you're choosing to read your own story or read your own change. Okay, and maybe that has to do with the position you're now occupying and how you're able to look back. But if we think about it following the same kind of format that I just discussed, we can have some sort of context that's important to set up the event. Some sort of like, I'm speaking about something that happened last week as I was walking home from school. I was in this kind of a headspace. That's a little bit of like the first bread, the context that we need to get, right? And then there's the middle part of it, the event itself, you could say. And there's the thing that happened and the description of it. And maybe you're trying to give that description in a pretty, well, descriptive way that doesn't yet belie your analysis of it, okay? Then there's this reflective piece, which is the analysis. It's how you choose to loop that into your larger argument. So if your larger argument is about how you changed, right? You're using this piece of evidence and you're picking it apart, you're analyzing it for its evidence of the change. So you might say some description of what your internal process was in response to that, or how, looking back on the situation now, that you can see that you made the particular moves that you made because of something, but you would have done it differently if you were in your current position, or because of the way that things happen in that particular order, you were led to this epiphany or this particular understanding that led you further down the path to this. But the evidence is your own experience. Or say the evidence is a piece of text. And so you were maybe doing the same sort of process I've just discussed of like introducing the text, but as a part of that, introducing where the text fits into your own life or your understanding of a particular idea. So that's kind of the context that you're giving. So as I was reading this text, I didn't yet have any knowledge of blank, okay, of imperialism or something like that. Then some introduction of the text itself. Within the text, however, so-and-so describes how what appears to be globalism is in fact sort of contemporary imperialism. Okay, then the analysis of that has to do with both the quote, but about your own internal change, and saying, reading that, specifically the idea that globalism is a form of imperialism, I realized that participating in these sort of imperialist, globalist scenarios, and it made me feel blank. So the setup, the sort of like three-part introduction text analysis of it is kind of the same, and it's all pointing back to the idea that you yourself are using this paper to demonstrate change. Okay, I hope all of that has made sense. I think we are just going to leave it there with the idea that evidence should always be paired with analysis, right? Analysis has to do with lending your particular interpretation to a source or a factor, a statistic. That source could be your own experience of being in the world. It could be a story that someone else has told you, or it could be a piece of writing, or it could be a table that you're reading, any of those things. But in any case, you're always using the analysis to loop back to the central argument of the paper. Okay, that's it for tonight. Thank you for being present through all of this. I look forward to seeing you, or to you seeing me, next week.